And it's a great pleasure right now to welcome to our show today a woman who's going to talk a little radio. And, I always love talking radio and broadcasting. Her name is Lindee Rochelle. She has written a book called Blast from Your Past, Rock and Roll Radio DJs Who Rocked Your World. We're going to talk about some of the famous and well-known DJs, not only nationally, but maybe locally and regionally that have made an impact in radio. And Lindee Rochelle joins us from San Diego today. How are you, Lindee?
Hi there. I'm just doing great, Doug. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Always great to talk to somebody who loves radio. I think all of us in this business like talking about it, and you've kind of made it a vocation to write about it. That must have been kind of interesting for you to write this book.
It has been. It's just been an absolute delight to do, and I just see myself fading right off into retirement doing this.
Are you a radio listener as a kid and just kind of loved it that way, or did you come to it a little bit later as an adult?
No, actually, I had my transistor radio. It literally rode with me on my bicycle handlebars. It went everywhere with me when I was a kid, and I loved radio and loved listening to the DJs. They were fun. They were energetic back then, and just, had a lot more flexibility, shall I say, in what they could do and say on the air. And so it was a great time back then, and we just seem to be losing so many of them now. I wanted to get some of those stories in print so that they have a legacy.
I know if you watch the trades with what's going on in radio, particularly within the last week as we tape this. I mean, you're hearing about radio DJs and broadcasters being let go. The whole industry has changed, going to more syndicated. But you go back to the heyday of radio, which you're talking about 54 to about 79 as far as rock and roll radio. I mean, these guys and occasional women in there too really made the station. I mean, you grew up with these people, right?
They did, and they made big bucks, some of those guys, because they were the personality. Personality is the big word for that particular time frame, because you were a personality behind that microphone, and you could make or break a station, literally. And some of them were clustered in areas like New York and Cincinnati and Cleveland and Chicago and San Francisco and eventually San Diego. It was a little slow to the turn here, to the turntable, but there were all those different pockets of DJs, and a lot of them made their names there, but they didn't start there necessarily. Anybody in particular you want to talk about today, and maybe we can kind of...
Sure, yeah. I grew up in New York, and I think a lot of our listeners may have heard some of these guys. I just do want to mention before we get to the later guys, I guess one of the first rock and roll DJs of what you call a top 40 format, was it Alan Freed? Was he the first that kind of became known as a rock DJ?
Well, yeah, he was the one that pretty much gave us the term rock and roll. And although, there's always stories that bounce around about who's first about this and that, who was the first one to give us the terminology, and who was the first band, for instance, to have what would be classified a rock and roll song. And when I was into the research and everything on this, I was actually surprised at how far back rock and roll basically goes. But Alan Freed is the one that got everybody's, how can I say it? Got your mojo working.
Right.
He was the one that really coined the term rock and roll. So that started about 53, 54, when he was already thumping his telephone books at that time, from what I understand. Now, see, you got to remember, I'm a California girl, so all of this stuff I came by in doing my research and talking with my DJs, because we didn't have that interconnection that we have now with the internet. What was going on in California on this side of the coast was completely different than what was going on in the eastern side of the country. And we didn't really know. And then there's the guys in between.
Now didn't Wolfman Jack actually start out by you in California? Another great radio voice. Wasn't he from California originally?
He actually made his name in California and south of the border, but he came from over in the southeastern part of the country and started over there as a young person. And but he made his way west very early and broadcast. He made his big name when he was broadcasting from XERF across the border, because it was what they call a flamethrower. It was a 50,000-watt station, which was practically unheard of
Oh,
at
sure.
that time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, he made his name, and he was one of the big guys, and he actually ended up at WNBC for a while in '73.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe the first character DJ. I mean, everybody sort of had a character, but he really created that whole Wolfman persona with the sound effects and the gravelly voice. And I mean, he really took that probably to its highest level, that type of character, right?
You know what's funny is that he actually used to kind of be called Wolfman by his nephews, because he used to play with them like that and scare them and everything, and he would be the Wolfman. And that's how he took that persona and just made himself a name with it.
You mentioned the
He
station.
loved Halloween, and he loved the whole horror movie thing that was going on. Of course, back then we had all those B movies, they called them.
Oh, yeah.
And in the horror genre, and he loved all that stuff.
You mentioned WNBC, as they used to say back then, and another man that became such a huge DJ, and now no more as kind of a talk host, maybe a little outrageous talk host, but Don Imus, who started out in Cleveland, and actually started in California, but came to Cleveland, then New York. He was another great name in radio.
He is. And he did the same thing going the opposite direction. He started out here, went the East Coast, and then some other ones started on the East Coast, mostly in Philadelphia, and then they made their way west. Don Imus is one. Dan Ingram, he was just a huge WABC person. And long term, this is another thing that is practically unheard of these days, I'm sure you know, and that's keeping a job in radio.
I want to talk about WABC, and I had that on my list there. You had such a great lineup back in the heyday of Top 40 radio. Dan Ingram, Ron Lindee, and Harry Harrison. I think that was the morning, afternoon, and late afternoon drive lineup of DJs. Almost like the murderer's row of the Yankees back then. Great talent.
Now, I can go back even further than that. WABC actually in September of 1961 had Scott Muni, Sam Holman, Charlie Greer, Herb Oscar Anderson, Dan Ingram, and Bruce Morrow.
Known as Cousin Brucey to most radio listeners.
Not then.
Not then, though, right?
Well, not on this survey that I have, anyway. But, yes, Cousin Brucey, and Cousin Brucey was just a crack-up to interview. He is in the book. Don Imus, unfortunately, I wasn't able to talk to anyone about him, but I did get Cousin Brucey on the phone, and he was just a crack-up for a good hour and a half. We had so much fun. But he also talked about Dan Ingram and his time at WABC, which was really special to him. WINS is where he really made his name to start with, but he went from there to WABC, and even though WINS let him go, it was probably, he said, the best thing that could have happened.
Now WINS it became a news station in the mid-'60s, but it was a rock and roll station back in its heyday. Another station in New York was WMCA. I think they called them the Good Guys. I worked at a station where one of those guys was the program director, Dean Anthony. So he was a New York rock and roll DJ. I think he did overnights, but I think ABC was probably the king of that, at least in my era, late '60s throughout the '70s.
It was. It really was. And Cousin Brucey, when they had that lineup with Cousin Brucey and Dan Ingram and Scott Muni and those guys, it was just, I'm sure it was dynamite back then, But I have a little known fact about Cousin Brucey that is really fun. He started, do you know where he started out?
I don't know, no.
Very big. In Bermuda.
Is that right?
Uh-huh. He was in Bermuda. I have to think about this for a second. Let's see. WBM in Bermuda.
Wow.
And he didn't even realize until he was telling me about it that was W. Bruce Morrow.
Okay.
Yeah. But the thing with Cousin Brucey is he was just a kid. That was his first real gig, and he didn't know what he was going to do if he had to move to Bermuda because, who was going to do his laundry? He still lived at home. The interesting thing, and I think it says a lot about our culture at that time, is Bruce, of course, is Jewish, which, you know, there's a lot of Jewish people in New York and a lot of people that Jewish across the country, and that's just, you know, we accept each other, hopefully, most of the time, in whatever culture you are. But he went to Bermuda, and it was a couple of weeks after he had made friends with his, let's see, what he was in a boarding house at the time, and that's where the station set him up. And so he'd made friends with the lady who owned the boarding house, and she was cooking him breakfast and doing all this good stuff for him. And unfortunately, she said the one thing that Bruce just could not believe. She says, "We don't want Jews on this island."
Wow.
Now remember, we're talking way back in the late 50s. So things were way different. It was a tough situation, and that's one reason why the 60s was so wild and crazy, because we were shaking things up by that time as far as cultures were concerned. But that was his first wake-up call about the real world. And he had a lot of fun at Bermuda, and he really made his way. By the time he was done, he left there with having helped a church rebuild. He did an event that brought in so much money for this church that they were actually able to rebuild after a fire. And that was his last big gig before he left Bermuda.
Wow.
So he went out with a bang.
Yeah, that's a great story. I did not know that he that he started
he was
there.
very honest and very upfront about some of the things that happened with him at that time and to him, and you know, he was just really a pleasure to talk with, and he just gave me his whole story. And some of it, you know, he's written a couple of books on his own.
Right.
And so, you know, I was trying to get him to give me some tidbits, you know, that you didn't already put in all your books, Bruce. I think we did okay.
I think what most people remember, at least what I remember listening to these guys, is the great patter that they had, and there was an art form to being a DJ. I mean, you had to talk up a record right before the singer would come on. You had to get in and out quickly. You had to do little funny bits in maybe 20, 30 seconds. I mean, it was a fast-paced format. Done well, it was as good as any radio format ever. I don't think there's anybody doing it today. There isn't really any top 40 anymore, but it wasn't easy to do, and there was only a handful of guys that could do it well, right?
This is true, and not only that, they were relying somewhat on the engineer to help them out, but they didn't have just push buttons like there is now, you know?
Right.
They had a whole board full of things that they had to, you know, their levers that they had to flip, and they had to take care of their ETs, which were the where they kept the commercials and everything, and they had to cue those up, and they had to take calls, and they had to talk to people coming into the studio. So yeah, they were busy guys trying to also get that turntable going and getting the music on at the right time.
Yeah, spinning your own records, queuing them up. I know in the bigger stations, the engineer would probably do that for you, but working all that together with no script, I mean, they had a couple things written down, but basically improvising 3 or 4 hours a day, very difficult to do, and I don't think they get the credit, maybe they should, as some other forms of broadcasting, because I've tried that. I wasn't a good rock and roll DJ. I did some of that in college. I've done jazz and big bands. It's a little bit different pace, but that's hard to do with those guys. With those guys
why
did.
would rock and roll be more difficult than jazz, for instance? Is it just because it's a more energetic kind of music, or?
I think it's a style you have to have. It's kind of a rapid-fire pace. The songs are only about 2 minutes, maybe 2.5 tops, whereas jazz and big bands could go, 3, 4, some longer. Those types of records. So it's a slower-paced kind of show,
right,
but
yeah. In between.
But I miss that form of radio. You hear it, I guess, occasionally, although even satellite radio doesn't have DJs much anymore. So I think Cousin Brucey may be on satellite radio, but even those guys, you don't hear them there. So I miss that format.
That's why that realradio.com is fun, because you go there and listen to the air checks, and it's the way it was, complete with jingles. You know?
Oh yeah, the jingles, right?
With jingles anymore.
Jingles and the IDs, and and that kind of echo sound that a lot of the big stations had, that it really made the voice boom out of your radio back then.
And someone like Dr. Don Rose, he had all his bells and whistles and cow sounds and whatever. Oh, and Woo Woo Ginsburg, Arnie Ginsburg.
Oh sure. Howard
Yeah.
Stern was talking about him on the show the other day. Now, I don't remember hearing him directly, but I heard the name. But he sounded like he was a character.
He had a train whistle. And
Yeah.
that's how he got the name Woo Woo. So it was a whole different attitude. You know, it was so much more free form, which of course that terminology as far as radio is concerned came into play a little bit later and when the FM stations came up. But it was still that attitude that, you know, they could pretty much do anything. I mean, some of the antics that are in the book, for instance, Cousin Brucey was telling me about how, was it Dan? Yeah, Dan Ingram he threw like a whole bag of dimes out the, seventh floor that they were on, their radio station. And just threw the dimes out the window and watched people pick them up. About $100 worth, I think he said. What are you doing? But, you know, those are the kinds of crazy things that they did.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk a little bit about some of the DJs on the West Coast. Of course, L.A., we mentioned before we started to record the interview. Gary Owens is a great radio voice out there. Peter Marshall, a lot of people know him from television, but I believe he still does some radio out there. Wink Martindale, Jim Lang, a lot of the game show hosts. Dick Clark, of course. I mean, L.A. had its own share of great radio voices, right?
I know. And that's one reason for these books, is to kind of, you know, leave a legacy for some of these guys that don't write their own books like Cousin Brucey does, and tell some of their stories and what it was like back then. And, you know, they would float back and forth. Now, some of them, like Wink Martindale and Gary Owens, they went into television.
Right.
I have one guy that I interviewed, Neil Blaze. He's another one. He's actually done the announcing and everything for, like, the Academy Awards and the Emmys and that sort of thing. So, you know, a lot of the guys started out in radio, and maybe they didn't stay as a DJ, but they went into program directing, or they started buying their own radio stations. Some of them have done that as well. But, you know, it was such a special time back then, the 50s through the 70s especially. Rock and roll was new. You know, the radio was new as far as the medium that it gave us with the rock and roll and everything. Radio had been around for a while, but before these guys started and before rock and roll came up, it was shows like The Shadow, or, you know, they would have literally drama shows that
Right.
would be over the radio, and you know, there wasn't music. They had farm reports.
That's right. Right.
Things like that, yeah. So it was a whole new ball game, and it was an infancy that just really grew into a fantastic medium that we have now. And rock and roll, of course, I mean, what's new in rock and roll? Do you know of anything new in rock and roll?
I kind of lost interest a long time ago.
I know. I hate to say that, you know, but it evolved from rhythm and blues and what was called black music at that time,
Right.
and race music.
Race music, yeah.
Yeah, and race music, and that's what it was called then. And I bet you can't guess what city purportedly, now I'm not going to say that this is the very first one, it's just that this is the one when I did my research that came up most often, but what city actually played what would be considered the first rock and roll song?
Rock and roll. I thought I read somewhere it was something like Memphis or Nashville.
Yep, Nashville.
Nashville, okay.
Country
Station, right?
That's where rock and roll pretty much started.
It kind of came out of like Sun Records, Elvis, and all those guys back then, didn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
The rhythm and blues and the soul music, that was kind of, you know, like I said, it evolved. In the book, I say that the book itself is an MOR, which of course is middle of the road, because it's a blend of all the different things that were going on at that time that created that music and created our radio, rock and roll radio.
One other voice didn't mention a big name out in L.A. radio, Rick Dees. I guess he was kind of a little bit later on, but he was pretty popular, right?
He was, as was Tom Donahue. Tom Donahue is actually considered the grandfather of FM radio or freeform, and he's the one that started the album-oriented type music.
In New York, Jonathan Schwartz. I don't know if you had a chance to talk to him.
I don't know.
He started out on the FM side and went to AM, WNEW Radio in New York. It was a great radio station. Not rock and roll necessarily, but played the standards and kind of middle of the road for many years. Some great voices there as well, like William B. Williams and Ted Brown and Jim Lowe, but not necessarily top 40, but again, great radio voices. So that's where he wound up.
At one time, they were top 40. Do you remember Allison Steele?
I remember she came on later on. I used to listen to her, yeah.
Yeah, she was in 79. I have a great calendar from WNEW that has Allison Steele, Richard Neer, Scott Muni, Dave Herman, Pete Fornatale, a couple of others. And it's a great calendar, and it's from 1979 at WNEW. And apparently they were playing top 40 at that time.
You're talking about the FM side, WNEW FM, right? The AM side played the jazz and big bands and standards, so they both sides. But Allison Steele did work on both at one point, both stations. But
the late 60s and early 70s was a little bit confusing because they'd have the same station in AM and FM.
Right.
And they'd play different things.
Well, it's a great book, and any radio fan, if you grew up listening to any type of top 40 DJ, or even if you haven't, you're going to get a chance to read some of the history of some of those great voices. It's called Blast from Your Past, Rock and Roll Radio DJs Who Rocks Your World. We've been talking with Lindee Rochelle today, and Lindee, give out a website or a place where they can get the book, maybe send you a message too if they like.
Absolutely. It's www.blastfromyourpast.net, and they can go to the website. There's information on how to reach me at Lindee, Lindee, at blastfromyourpast.net. And the print book will be available soon. It should be out in a couple of weeks. I am taking pre-orders if anyone wants to do that, and that's on the website as well. And the e-book is already available on Amazon.com.
Great. Hang on the line if you will, Lindee. A couple things I wanted to ask you about, but it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and we look forward to definitely we'll do it again. Always great to talk some radio.
And as soon as I come out with that 25-year book, we'll definitely have to talk some more.
Great. Thanks, Lindee.
There was definitely sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the 60s and 70s.